Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Well, Boris has to be careful that he doesn't find that it's changed from being a Johnson government to being a Cummings government.
Super Saturday! What once signified Team GB's best day at London Olympics in over a century now signifies, well, the beginning of the end of a pandemic, we hope. How times have changed since those heady days in 2012. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. We're approaching the weekend where most of the country will be getting a much-needed haircut, I know I need one, or making their way to a coveted and socially distant table in their local pub. In England, that is. But this week also saw the introduction of a local lockdown in Leicester, as there our number rose, meaning they miss out on our new complicated freedoms. Well, if you're using said freedom to go out and shop, do stick around for my guest Adam Marshall, Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, on why that's exactly what we need to be doing to help Britons survive. Plus Brexit. Remember that? This podcast was called Chopper's Brexit Podcast until the spring. I'll be joined by Mark Francois, Chairman of the European Research Group of Conservative MPs, to talk about that letter he wrote to Michel Barnier this week. But first up, this week's been sadly punctuated so far by companies making large job cuts. As the furlough scheme starts to wind down and companies start to pay more of their staff's wages, Britain's unemployment looks set to reach new record levels, higher even than those in Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s, when unemployment hit more than 3 million. Someone who remembers that period very well is Norman Tebbit, former chairman of the Conservative Party and a prominent cabinet minister throughout the Thatcher era. And I was lucky enough to catch up with him earlier from his home. We had to speak over the phone, so the quality isn't up to our usual standards, but the content certainly is. Well, Lord Tebbit, Norman Tebbit, welcome to Chopper's Politics. I hope this finds you well.
Yes, indeed. In good order.
Good.
Just getting old.
Well, we all are. But I think you're ageless to many people, Norman Tebbit. Norman, what did you make of Boris Johnson's speech? Did you hear it on Tuesday?
I read it. And I think, as always, Boris is obsessed with words. I've known him for a very long time. When I was a non-executive director on The Spectator magazine, and Boris was the editor.
Oh, gosh.
So I've seen Boris in many different guises. And I think that he's obsessed with the flow of words, and sometimes the meaning is a little bit obscure.
Yes, well, we'd been briefed he was going to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wasn't he, with this New Deal investment. But really, it was just £5 billion brought forward from the 100 billion promised in December's election. So it wasn't actually a big figure at all, was it?
That's right. What we're looking at now is a situation where the economy is being dealt a very heavy blow by the COVID outbreak, simply closing down businesses and leaving people at home unable to work. So our production has fallen enormously. And I think the Chancellor is probably about right in trying to get more money out to get that economy moving again. And once people can get out and get to work, have some money, spend it in the shops, perhaps go on holidays, preferably not overseas, but spend it here, then things will begin to improve again. I don't think it will be quick, but they will begin to improve.
Well, let's hope so. Do you have any idea what Johnsonism is? We know what Thatcherism was, and do you know what Boris Johnson's political credo is?
I think it's about presentation. I think he's, broadly speaking, a liberal conservative. But as for his views on economics, I think they're flexible, shall we say. And the problem is that we don't always know what is Boris and what is Mr. Cummings.
Well, we'll come on to Mr. Cummings shortly. Do you think Boris Johnson would have got into Margaret Thatcher's cabinet maybe after 1983 when Thatcherism took hold?
I think he might have finished up as doing the job which I did at the end, party chairman. I think that's the most likely thing. that Boris as party chairman, bringing the party forward rather than Boris as an executive. I don't have the highest opinion of Boris as an executive.
No, I can sense that. You mentioned there Dominic Cummings. What do you make of the Mark Sedwill resignation? I don't think the NSA, the National Security Advisor position, was there when you were in government, but certainly the Cabinet Secretary job was there. What do you make of this new political appointment to that role and the moving of Mark Sedwill out of that job?
Well, Boris has to be careful that he doesn't find that it's changed from being a Johnson government to being a Cummings government, and that he has changed to being a spokesman for Mr. Cummings as opposed to the other way around.
Do you worry then that he may have been slightly captured by people like Dominic Cummings in a sense that they're in control and he isn't in the same way?
Yes, I think so. You see, it's perfectly right and proper for the Prime Minister to decide who amongst his officials he wants to do which jobs. And I think probably in my time in government, in Thatcher's time, that we had a better core of professional civil servants. I think the standard is not quite so high now, and I wouldn't want to hold a brief from Sedwill, but I think that you have to be careful about bringing people into a business who don't understand the business.
Yes, quite. And well, we can take a view on the level and quality of civil servants. This week has been punctuated by daily job loss announcements, and it probably will get worse, sadly, because of the furlough as that's being lifted and more companies must pay the wages of their staff. You famously said, didn't you, in 1981, how you grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for a job, looked for work, and he kept looking until he found it. Do you think, would you say that again now? Is that your message, do you think, to those losing their jobs?
I think it's more difficult now because of the greater restrictions on how you qualify for work. But the one thing we have got is a greater measure of freedom from the trades union interference. And we've seen how adverse and malign that can be in the way that the teachers' unions have been opposing the reopening of schools. They have been concerned with their welfare rather than the welfare of the children who they're paid to educate.
Well, quite, but it looks like the government's getting a grip on this. I think I've been saying for a while now that if it happens that in September private schools open fully and state schools only open partially, I think that'll be political suicide for this government. I think that will be a real crisis in education, let alone the one we have at the moment.
Yes, the kids are entitled to get an education. Of course, that had to go to one side with the peak of the COVID plague, and hopefully we won't get a second wave of that to interfere with the kids' education again. But they should be going to school. That will then liberate their parents to also go to work. And a lot of working mothers can only work because their children are at school.
Just going back to the issue of unemployment, if we do get to 3 million unemployed, what lessons do you think we can learn from the 1980s? Because that was more of an issue of oversupply in some sectors, wasn't it, compared to its lack of demand in this current environment?
What happened in the 80s was that as we began to free up management and workers themselves from the stranglehold of the union bosses, that labour began to be shed without any loss of productive capacity. In fact, productive capacity went up as the excess labour was shed. That's not the case now. In general, we don't have that problem of union obstructionism, except, as I've said, in areas like education. So it's a matter now of stimulating the economy in order to bring back higher levels of demand, in order to bring back higher levels of employment.
Yeah. Well, what's your verdict on the government's handling of the COVID crisis? I mean, it's something which your government never faced in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher, but it obviously is a novel virus. No one knew what it was. Have they been too led, do you think, by the science or by opinion polling?
I think that it's very hard to say, even in retrospect, what would have been the right thing to have done at each stage. If you then put that on one side, sit back and say, well, yes, but we didn't know that at that time. What should we have done? And I think that on the whole, they've done about right. And certainly I can't think that any other administration would have had some magic formula with which they could have done better.
You don't look at other countries like Germany with their much more effective testing strategy and what seems to be and we'll as we look into this in the inquiry that will no doubt come forward, we'll be seeing this. But it seems the government has been quite late on virtually every metric tackling this crisis. Or do you think that they played it safe each time?
Well, I think they played it reasonably. Whether if they had taken different decisions, things would have turned out better, or almost certainly so. But you can't say that, no. And you can't be sure of that. And I thought, who was the great American general who said that what worried him most was not the known unknowns, but the unknown unknowns? There's been a hell of a lot of unknown unknowns around in the recent months.
I think that was Donald Rumsfeld, wasn't it? I think, yes, famously. And he was mocked for that remark. But actually, if you read it, it makes complete sense. Of course, yes. Brexit's coming our way. I mean, by that, I mean we're leaving the transition period. Are you optimistic for the UK, finally, when we get a deal or not a deal or whatever happens after December?
I think that it may well be that we don't get a deal, because the only deals which our friends on the continent are interested in are ones which would not leave us as a fully free nation. They would leave us in some way subject to the European courts and judiciary, or subject to their standards of all sorts of things in commerce and in industry. To be free, we have to be completely free. You can't be half free. And so if it comes to the point where they are still being silly about fisheries and things of that kind, well, we shall leave without a deal. It would be advantageous if we found ways of accepting easing of customs procedures and things like that, but that will come over the next decade. You can always enter agreements post-Brexit if it seemed to be in our advantage to do so.
Well, Norman Tebbit, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I've got to ask you about the row about statues. Is there a statue anywhere to Norman Tebbit? Not to my knowledge, and I think it might have been attacked by now. But I was going to say,
my contempt for these people who daubed the cenotaph and tried to topple Churchill's statue is utter and complete. They are amongst the nastier creatures of life.
Is not the case maybe that they're misguided or uninformed, rather than being, as you say, the language you used there was very, very strong? Do you not think that it's a question of educating people more than anything else?
Yes. You see, so often, the media, the BBC particularly, if something happens which is objectionable, unpleasant, it's held to be the far right who are at the bottom of it.
So you think we're viewing it through the wrong prism, basically, that we're seeing it's not so much as a right-wing problem as a left-wing problem, attacking these statues?
Yes. After all, we of the right believe that a government's functions should be limited, that a government's functions should be to defend our frontiers against unwelcome intruders, should be to provide a system of criminal law so that the citizen can walk his way in peace on the Queen's highway, and a system of civil law in order that disputes between citizens can be settled peaceably. After that, the business of government is options. The government doesn't have to be the provider of health services. It doesn't have to be the provider of education. Now, it may well be that it's best that they are, but they don't have to be. So we look at the business from what government do you need, not how much government can you have.
Well, there we have it. Norman Tebbit, Lord Tebbit, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Podcast. It's been great to have you on. Thank you.
Oh, many thanks.
Right, stick around. Soon we'll be talking about whether the middle of a global pandemic is really the time to be disengaging from the European Union at the end of our transition period, with Chairman of the ERG, Mark Francois, right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
And we're back. In case you thought we'd forgotten our roots here at Choppers Politics, formerly known as Choppers Brexit Podcast, think again. A few days ago, Mark Francois MP, the Tory chairman of the European Research Group of Conservative MPs, put pen to paper and wrote a letter to the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. He told Monsieur Barnier that a Brexit deal selling out UK interests wouldn't be passed by MPs in Parliament, and he joins me now to tell me why. Mark Francois, chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
This time last year, mention of the ERG would have brought a look of terror into any government minister's eyes because of the kicking you or a colleague may have been about to administer on the government's Brexit policy. Are you content with the way that Brexit's being handled by the current government, the way they're trying to get a deal on the political declaration this summer and everything signed off by the autumn? Is this the timescale you're happy with?
Yes, because critically, we are now through the 1st of July deadline. It wanted to extend the transition period, as some were calling for. We had to do that by law, by 1st July. Well, we didn't do that. So what that means is that one way or another, we will leave the transition period at the end of 2020. It's not true to say that we would leave with no deal, because we're already leaving the European Union with a deal, the revised withdrawal agreement. The question is, can we agree a further deal, which would be a comprehensive free trade agreement, which both sides committed to in principle in the revised political declaration. So if we can do that, that's what we want. If we can't do that, we leave under Australian/WTO terms.
Is now the right time? I mean, companies are going through an existential crisis about this response to the COVID crisis. It's another degree of uncertainty for them.
No, the opposite is true. If we were to extend the transition period, all we do is create further uncertainty. Companies know now, because we're through the 1st of July, that we will leave the transition period at the end of the year. That provides them with a degree of certainty against which plan. There's no point, kicking the can endless down the road. We did that under Theresa May for 2 years and it was a disaster. So actually, we've taken some firm decisions. And the other difference is that we've now got a negotiating team under David Frost who are negotiating on behalf of the United Kingdom.
I see, and you're content with the way it's going. You wrote this week, didn't you, to Michel Barnier, in which you said, make sure the deal is one that can get through the House of Commons. And it was almost a warning, almost a support mechanism for the David Frost team, wasn't it?
Well, we were being frank with Michel Barnier. If they were somehow to negotiate a deal which seriously impinged on British sovereignty, realistically, it would never get through the House of Commons in any event. Our message to Mr. Barnier, in essence, was, now that you know this, you may as well get down to business and negotiate something decent and get on with it.
Were you asked to write the letter by the government?
The European Research Group decided it would be a good idea to write Michel Barnier. It wasn't an aggressive letter, I don't think. We made our position perfectly clear. I believe, look, we'll find out in 6 months whether I'm right or not, won't we? I believe they will do a deal. Why? One, because empirical evidence showed last time they did. They swore line they wouldn't back down, but when push came to shove, they did. Two, Prime Minister and David Frost proved they're very capable negotiators. And thirdly, post-COVID, economically, they're in even more difficulty than we are. And historically, the one thing that's always really frightened them, and I use the word deliberately, is the idea of a United Kingdom, trade on world markets with a sort of Anglo-Saxon economic model, which over time would undercut them. They've always been frightened about that, which is one of the reasons they tried so hard to keep us in the European Union in the first place. If we go down the Australian WTO route, there's nothing they can do in international law to stop us. So now have a very strong incentive to strike a deal, because if they don't, then their worst nightmare comes true. So for all of those reasons, I believe we will get a deal, but if the EU behaves to type, they won't give in July. They'll only start to cave in the autumn.
Well, let's hope so, Mark Francois. Let's hope that your optimism is justified for the UK. Have you reflected on your role last year? You were seen as the pin-up boy for the Brexit movement. Did you enjoy it at all? How do you look back on the past 18 months or so?
Well, I've been reflecting on it, Chopper, because I've written a book.
Oh, right, okay.
During lockdown, I basically dictated my autobiography in the evening and at the weekends, and it goes into detail about the entire experience and what it was like to be in the middle of it, why we fought the way we did, what we thought was at stake, why it was so important. And I and my colleagues believe, some people might think this is hyperbole, but we believe that the destiny of the United Kingdom was literally at stake. And that's why we fought as tenaciously as we did.
What's it called?
It's called Spartan Victory.
Spartan Victory, and
of course I should be asking the Telegraph to serialise it. Well, actually, jokes aside, no, it's a matter of record that when it came to the real crunch, which was meaningful vote 3 on the 29th of March 2019, which was incredibly tense and difficult.
Yeah.
By that stage, the only media outlet that was still supporting us was the Telegraph. All the other national newspapers said that we should have folded. It was only the Telegraph that stuck us. And we've never forgotten that.
Well, it wasn't Brexit for us.
Yeah, it never was. No disrespect. We were going to carry on fighting anyway, but you were the one media house that actually stuck with it. And, was it difficult holding out? Yes. Were we under incredible pressure? Yes.
And of course, Boris Johnson did vote in that key day, didn't he, for meaningful vote 3, which he may or may not regret now. I don't know, but he did vote for it.
He did. He voted against on meaningful vote 1 and 2 and switched on meaningful vote 3. You might argue that worked well for him in the end because he became Prime Minister and was able to deliver a genuine Brexit. So you could argue from his point of view, he made the right call.
So he's being very strategic and political by doing so. Well, we'll wait for his memoir on that one. For this weekend, normally, Mark Francois, you and I are in the pub sharing a coffee before 11 o'clock. Where will you be on this weekend, July the 4th?
My first priority is to get my hair cut. And there's a local guy who I was at school with.
Okay.
Called Mark Hudson, who runs a barber shop in Rayleigh High Street, and I'm booked in that day to get my hair cut, and then probably later that day when the pubs are open, I'm going to go and have a pint in one of the pubs in my constituency just because I'm allowed to.
And what's your favourite tipple? Some Spitfire?
It's Old Speckled Hen, which is my particular favourite.
Old Speckled Hen.
Yeah.
Well, Mark Francois, until we can meet again in a pub Cheers, have a great weekend, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Christopher. Good to talk to you.
Now, this week is a tale of two halves. Consumers being let out into the wide world again, shops already open, and now pubs and even hairdressers too, in England at least. But the other side of the coin are job losses being announced in the retail sector, with John Lewis being the latest to say they can't reopen some of their stores. Here to discuss how business can survive in a post-furlough world is Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, Adam Marshall. Adam Marshall, the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, welcome to Choppers Politics. Where am I finding you? You're in a box room, you told me off air.
Yes, I've been working with my colleagues across the country from the box room at the top of my house for several months now. But what's great is that those business communities have come together and they're working hard to get through this difficult period and get back to growth.
Yeah, from your vantage point at the top of your house, what's your message to listeners to this podcast ahead of July the 4th, so-called Super Saturday?
Well, it's good that many businesses are going to have the opportunity to reopen. It's also important that both consumers and other businesses have the confidence to get out there safely. We've still got a long road to cover. Reopening is a start, but of course, we've got some serious challenges ahead for many of our businesses that we're going to have to navigate over the coming weeks and months too.
I remember in my world, in journalism, when the News of the World newspaper closed overnight, we all hoped that their readers, 3 million of them, would migrate to other newspapers. In fact, a lot of them just disappeared and never came back to newspapers. Is that a fear for you on the high street?
Well, there is real concern about the future of town and city centres. Chambers of Commerce around the country have been working on this issue for a number of years because it's not new during the coronavirus pandemic. There were already questions about whether the model on our high streets would work for the next 5, 10 or 15 years, given technological change and the way consumer preferences have been changing too. So I think that work to figure out what function town centres serve is going to be really, really important as we come out of the pandemic. People are social. They still want to gather. They still want to have entertainment opportunities. They still want to have experiences too. But we're going to have to invest time, the best of our brain power, and I think financial resources too, in making sure that our places are strong for the future and can adapt to changes in consumer behaviour.
And you say there that people are social, which of course they are social. The problem with this dreadful virus is you can't be social with the virus, not in a meaningful sense. So won't a lot of people just think, I'm afraid, get the stuff quite easily on Amazon Prime, why go outside and risk my health? And how do you just reassure people that it is quite safe to shop and worth shopping?
Well, first of all, businesses have done a huge amount to make sure that they are COVID safe. We talk to firms all across the country that have spent the last days and the last weeks getting ready to reopen, making sure that they can welcome their customers back, making sure that they sanitize their premises and have great processes in place so that people can feel safe, both on high streets and in other parts of the economy too. And you want people to be able to get out there and use those facilities as safely as they can. Yes, some preferences will have changed. Not everyone is going to go back to doing things the way that they did before. But we want to do everything in our power to give people the confidence that they can go back to their favorite local businesses. And that, of course, patronizing those businesses in their local economy means that their town and city centers will be vibrant and that there will be things to do for the future. So it's a virtuous circle if we can get people back safely into our town centers.
Are you saying it's almost a public duty to go shopping this weekend to support these shops that desperately need income?
I don't think it's a public duty to go shopping. I think it is a civic duty for all of us to consider how we can best support our local businesses. For those who are shielding or who have health conditions, there are ways to support your local businesses over the internet and via home deliveries. For those who are healthy and able to get out there are ways to enjoy your local businesses safely too, and to have confidence in doing so because of the work that so many businesses have put in to get ready for this. So we do hope that people will slowly, steadily get back and do whatever they can to help their local businesses thrive.
Do you think, though, that in the future we'll see more boarded up shops, that some shops just won't open, just won't come back at all?
There is no question in my mind that we are going to lose some businesses. Some will be shops and other business-to-consumer propositions for whom the market just isn't there anymore. The demand just isn't there, and they're forced to reconsider whether they can keep trading. Some will be other types of firms as well who've seen their market disappear. There'll be certain manufacturers, there'll be certain services companies or business-to-business firms too who will have been badly hit during this period. So there will be some churn and some change inevitably. When it comes to high streets and town and city centres, though, you don't want to see vacant and empty premises because that creates a negative feedback loop. You know, when you see one boarded up shop, another one then can come, and then you can see a whole place declining.
It's the broken window policy, isn't it, in New York famously? Yeah.
Indeed, which is why we need to get back to the question of how do we make sure that as many of these places can be brought back into use creatively and successfully and safely as quickly as possible.
Next week, Rishi Sunak is giving his next update on how to support the economy. It's not a budget, it's not a fiscal event, but it is an attempt to support companies going forward. What are your big asks at the BCC?
Well, we've said to the Chancellor that based on what we see happening in local business communities across the UK, he's got to go big next week. He's got to bring in some measures that help to stimulate both business and consumer confidence. And he's going to have to be courageous and do some things that help more companies get back on their feet. That can be everything from, cutting employers' national insurance contributions so that they can keep people in jobs, through to stimulus too, which could either be via something like a VAT cut or by vouchers to encourage people to shop in their local business community. We know that taking action is going to be expensive, and it's going to be something that will make many in the Treasury very nervous about the cost. But we think you have to go early and get ahead of the problems that we know are coming in the economy, rather than simply try to react after it happens. So the message to Rishi Sunak: go big, support business, support confidence, and support the economy.
How about extending the furlough, i.e. for those in restaurants, pubs, hotels who can't afford to get back with all their staff, they can just keep them on the books?
Well, there's definitely going to be a need for more support for some parts of the economy. For those businesses that are only just starting to reopen, or those who are not yet allowed to reopen, the notion of the furlough scheme coming to an end on the 1st of October is extraordinarily challenging. So we do hope that the government will consider additional support for those parts of the economy that aren't able to just pick back up, dust themselves off and get going as if nothing happened. Also with the furlough, in October, it will go from paying 77% of wages to nothing overnight. That's a big cliff edge. And I'm sure what the Chancellor and the government don't want to see is businesses cutting huge numbers of jobs because they're unsure of how to support them. So taking action to both support employment and to look at how you smooth that cliff edge are going to be really important.
And just finally, we've seen a succession of job loss announcements so far this week, Adam Marshall. Is that as bad as it will get, that rate of loss, or will it get worse?
Well, I'm under no illusion that we will see more redundancies over the autumn and winter of this year. I think unemployment will worsen, hopefully temporarily, but I think it will worsen, and that we haven't seen the last of, sort of high-profile big redundancies. That's to be expected in a period when you have so much economic change and such a big economic shock going on. That's why the government needs to take action to help as many companies who are on the borderline as possible to preserve those jobs and hold out for the return in demand, which we know will be coming. Otherwise, we could see more of those redundancies than might otherwise be necessary.
And in a letter, will the recession be a V, a W, an L, or a U?
I don't do alphabet soup, Chris.
Adam Marshall, until we talk again on the podcast, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks to my guests this week, Lord Tebbit, Mark Francois, and of course Adam Marshall. Hopefully soon I'll be back in the Red Lion pub with my guests, rather than navigating the tech of crackly lines from home. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Ludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening and leaving reviews and ratings on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help other people find this podcast and boost us up the podcast charts, which are really my only chance of ever having a number one. And if this podcast has left you hungry for more top-rate political analysis, head to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where listeners can get 30 days free access to all of our best coronavirus coverage, opinions, sport, politics, culture, and more, totally free. And if you can, it's safe to do so, please always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, cheerio!